I hope everybody's having a great day. Today, I just want to add a little bit to the Alex Grant videos. He does a great job of talking about the history, and I just want to perhaps clear up a couple of things that might cause confusion. I also want to talk a bit about some of the terms that are frequently associated with comics and just kind of clarify a couple of things that I hope will help you understand the history of comics a little bit better. As always, for the YouTube bots, the images and quoted text are used for educational purposes. I'm not trying to make a profit off of this, just trying to give you an idea of, give my students an idea of what happens in comic books. Alex Grant breaks comic books down into a few ages. And I think it's important to understand that there have probably always been comics. The cave paintings were a form of sequential art. That's what qualifies as comics according to the Eisner definition that we talked about last week. The picture on the screen right now is a picture of Heracles and the Bull Marathon. It's on a vase, and the vase has all 12 of his labors. It is a comic book or a comic, it has the sequential art, just like a comic book. Grand begins with the printing press and the proto comics. I think that that's fine, but I do think that sequential art happened before the printing press. That's the point I want to make here. And I think it's important to understand that sequential art was always political. The Catholics and Martin Luther during the Reformation put out cartoon panels, sometimes in sequential order, satirizing the stances taken by the opposite side. The Platinum Age, Grant talks about 1897 to 1937. It predates the comic book. It predates the superhero comic book. The Golden Age, 38 through 1947, basically the World War II era. The Atomic Age, the television age, where TV started influencing comic books, and I want to talk about how that never went away. The Silver Age, where the Flash showed up as Barry Allen instead of Jay Garrick, running until about 1969. The Bronze Age until 1984. And it was in 1985 that we had that big, huge reboot that DC did with Crisis. And we'll talk about Crisis throughout this presentation. Crisis gets mentioned frequently in the other history of the DC universe. We'll see that Crisis on Infinite Earths is a landmark in separating the current age of comic book reading and the older ages. Sort of a dark age when dark material, not as magic or anything, but when darker, more adult material started coming into comic books. The extreme age that almost ruined comics in a lot of ways, and the movie age. We'll talk about, Grand does a better job of talking about those than I do. We're just going to list these here so that you have them as a reference if you choose to do a summary response paper about any of them. I want to go back and just talk about a couple of things. The Yellow Kid, the idea that the text on the t shirt eventually became the speech balloons, and the idea that comics have always been part of marketing. Pop Tarts, for example, a year or so ago, had a bunch of comic book connections to it. The Yellow Kid from the newspapers, his image was used on cigar boxes, it was used to sell cigarettes, it was used to sell whiskey. It was an adult thing, even though comics are supposed to be for kids. Next, the Jammer Kids. First of all, the Jammer Kids, I think, epitomized the trope. You'll listen to a video about tropes, and a trope is just a common, repeated, overused literary device or plot detail, and that trope can be across a genre or it can be within a specific genre. This happened almost every week with the Jammer Kids. They pulled a prank, excuse me. They got punished, and there was a repeat. And there was this idea that somehow, and perhaps even rightfully so, that this was somehow subversive. It was teaching kids that it's okay to kind of break the rules. And because of that, there was a huge backlash from the public. And if that backlash wasn't enough, in World War I, because you didn't have sauerkraut, you had Liberty cabbage. In World War I, the Katzenjammer kids became the shenanigan kids because Katzenjammer was far too German for the public to grab a hold of and keep reading and things like that. So I think it's important to understand that comics are political, have always been political, or if they have not been political themselves, they have been subject to politics throughout their history, whether it's in the newspaper prints like the Katzenjammer Kids, or as we'll see later in other presentations in regular comic books. One of the things that gets mentioned in the Grand videos is the character Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy, I think, is important for two reasons. Number one is what's on this slide right here, the Rogues Gallery. All of the bad guys that Dick Tracy faced repeatedly throughout the years. Now, a lot of them were not very serious, a lot of them were not very dangerous, a lot of them were comical in the sense that they were actually funny. A few of them were a lot more serious, a few of them were a lot more dangerous, but for the most part, it's kind of tough to be frightened of a character named Itchy or a character named Mrs. Pruneface or Pruneface, and a character who was always shaky. It's a little bit tough. So the Rogues Gallery wasn't always that frightening. But again, Mr. Mxyzptlk from the Superman Rogues Gallery is more of a nuisance than he is frightening. So this idea of the Rogues Gallery from the Dick Tracy comic strip, I think, comes through completely and totally in The Flash, in Superman, in Batman. Spider-Man, I think you could argue, has a great Rogues Gallery. The Rogues Gallery began here with Dick Tracy. I think that's important to understand. I want to talk a bit about Miss Fury and the idea of women writing comics and women appearing in comics. And Miss Fury, I think, is just somebody who's overlooked. And we'll come back to her in a couple of different ways a little bit later in this presentation. But she first appeared in the newspaper comics in 1941. She had the skin of a black leopard, and that became her costume. She was a rich socialite, kind of Batman esque, and she was the crime busting nemesis of gangsters and evil. She also went after the Nazis and saboteurs in World War II because everyone went after the Nazis and saboteurs in World War II. As I said, comics have always been political, or they've always had politics from the outside affect them. What I think is interesting is that black costume. The Black Widow seems to have taken the whole black bodysuit. Catwoman has the same sort of bodysuit. Black Cat has added some fur, but it's the same black bodysuit. Also, if you look at the mask, it strikes me that Hawkeye has that mask as well. And I just think it's important to understand that there were a lot of influences, whether it's in the art, whether it's in the character, whether it's the woman as a superhero or a form of a superhero. We don't talk about these characters enough, perhaps, and their influences on modern comics. Again, Grand does a far better job with the pulps than I do, but I do think it's important to just let you take another quick look at Doc Savage and the Man of Bronze and the fact that he had a cousin, Pat Savage, and he had this group surrounding him. And you'll see that I have on slide all are muscle and brains. That's a reference to the comic tropes of video where Chris talks about the kid gangs of the 1940s, 1950s, and the idea that some were muscle and some were brains and some were leaders. Doc Savage was the leader. But if you look at the descriptions here, all of them are a lot of muscle, all of them are a lot of brains. And again, they, along with Pat, are kind of the core of this Doc Savage thing. But again, if you take a quick look, 6 men, 1 woman, it's a little bit, that breakdown doesn't fit the fact that there are 50% of the world's population is women. In the comics or in the pulps, it was mostly men. And in the early comics, it was mostly men. The Shadow. I think it's important to understand that there's always been kind of just a cross pollination. The Shadow began as radio, went to the comics, and from the radio program, you kind of have this idea of who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men, and the Shadow being able to kind of hide in plain sight, and nobody can see him, and you can hear that maniacal laugh as he talks about the weed of crime bearing bitter fruit. And I think, again, it's important to understand that this is kind of where the Batman came from. You might argue that this is where, some of the other characters of the night, the street level characters like Daredevil, perhaps owes a bit to the Shadow as well, the extra senses and all that other sort of stuff. But certainly there's a link between pulp characters like this and the street level characters that Batman talks about, or that Grant talks about, that comic books have now. I just want to talk again about this idea that the Lone Ranger existed far before comics. He was a radio character, and there are been crossovers, and we'll talk about crossovers in a little bit, but there are always crossovers even within radio dramas trying to get things through time periods. And one of those examples of the crossover is the Lone Ranger and the Green Hornet. The Lone Ranger was named John Reed. He rides a stallion named Silver. He's assisted by a Native American named Tonto. Green Hornet is Britt Reed, who was John Reed's nephew. He drives a car called Black Beauty, and he's assisted by Kato and Asian. There's a lot of carryover both in plot details. There's a lot of carryover also in just this idea of character A is borrowed and put into character B. Certainly, the Lone Ranger, a writer of the Lone Ranger didn't think about, hey, I'm going to create a spin-off. And I want to mention just briefly, Tarzan, Zorro. Again, Tarzan gets from the newspapers to the comics, Zorro from a novel to the comics, from silent movies to the comics, and Tarzan appears today in books with Red Sonja. Zorro, as you'll see in a second, appears in books with other characters. Science fiction, all sorts of books like that have all been borrowed and used in comics, just like the pulps have all been borrowed and used in comics. And comics frequently license things so that you can have the Batman and Shadow fighting crime together. You can have the Shadow and the Green Hornet and Zorro all together. And characters like Miss Fury are in the public domain. So you can have Miss Fury in any kind of comic book you want, as long as you're not taking an image that was done more recently. But the name Miss Fury, the leopard skin, all of those sorts of things have entered into the public domain. So comic books can grab that and put together the Green Hornet and the Shadow and Miss Fury, or the Shadow and Zorro with licensing, or with licensing you can put Batman and the Shadow together. And notice that it was Dynamite Publishing, not DC Publishing, who put the pulp character the Shadow with the comic book character Batman. And just as a general aside, Grand mentions Popeye in one of his videos. Popeye will come into the public domain in 2025. Last year, it was a big deal when Steamboat Willie, the precursor for Mickey Mouse, entered the public domain. Pluto will enter the public domain in 2026. You'll notice Donald Duck in 2029, Superman in 2034, Batman in a little bit later. And when we're going to talk about comics and crossovers and public domain, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the ultimate campy crossover. The Green Hornet, that was a television program during the 1960s. It was pretty bad. Batman was a campy TV program in the 1960s. It was so bad it was good. And they had their own crossover with over a couple of episodes where Batman and Robin met the Green Hornet and Kato. And I want to talk about things coming full circle. Dick Tracy, certainly from the newspaper strips, influenced comic books, but in 2024, Mad Cave Studios has the licensing to create a Dick Tracy comic book. You've got the yellow hat, you've got the wristwatch that talks, that allows him to talk and communicate. It certainly has a darker tone than what I remember reading in the comic strips, but things come full circle. The comics were first print, or the newspaper comic strips were the first things printed in what we would now recognize as comic books. And now the comic book character, or the comic strip character, excuse me, gets his own comic book. Things come full circle. Grand also talked about TV influencing comics. When I was a little kid, Space Ghost was Saturday morning cartoon must view. I had to be up to watch Space Ghost. He's got his own comic again that came out this year. Harley Quinn began as a character in the 1990s Batman animated series. She has her own book. She frequently appears in Poison Ivy, the Suicide Squad books. TV has come to comics, and Grand, I don't think, mentions it much, but let's face it, the Marvel Cinematic Universe certainly has had a huge, huge influence on what happens in Marvel's books. I'll talk just briefly about this idea of continuity. Continuity is consistency in the depiction of characters and events within the same universe. Superman, within the DC universe, is supposed to somehow stay the same. But he's been around since 1938. Spider-Man, within the Marvel universe, is supposed to stay the same. But he's been around since 1961. Now, this crossover that happened, I can't remember when, but it was a long time ago because it only cost $2. This crossover, they don't have to act as if they're in continuity. Their personalities should be somewhat like they are in the Superman book or in the Spider-Man book, but they don't have to act as if they're in complete and total continuity because this never happened. All right? But I think it's important to understand that continuity is almost impossible over 80 years or 60 years. And so comic book writer Jonathan Hickman, gave a definition about continuity is what people remember and what sticks. And I think that that's important. Those of you who may be Star Wars fanatics and talk about what's canon and not canon, I think canon is what people remember and what sticks as well. Retcon. Retcon is retroactive continuity. It changes accepted facts about events and characters. For example, the Winter Soldier, Bucky Barnes, was believed to have died in World War II. And then he was resurrected in the last 15 years or so. And it gives us some believable reasons for the retcon. In the case of the Winter Soldier, the Soviets got him. They wiped his memories. They kept him in, you know, frozen and brought him back out every time they needed him to do a mission. It gives us a way to update the character. It covers up some problematic or dated material. Chris, in his comic tropes video, the problematic dealing of an African American character by Marvel, a retcon could clean up some of that. And most importantly, retcons allow writers to tell a new story the way the writer wants to tell it, which means that continuity is fluid, continuity can change, and the retcon might get retconned itself. Continuity is what sticks. I want to talk briefly about the reboot because that's what we're going to deal with next week with the Wonder Woman book when we talk about Wonder Woman. And you'll see that this was the new 52, that it was in new issue 1. It was a great way for readers to start out with new character, or let's try that again. It was a great way for new readers to start with established titles or characters. And that's a hard reboot. It starts from scratch. That's what the new 52 was. Soft reboot is like data getting backed up, but there was some new data and everybody gets confused because it's all kind of a mishmash. Reboot is the factory reset. We're starting over. Crisis on Infinite Earths created a reboot. And the Crisis on Infinite Earths, that gets mentioned again in the other history of the DC Universe, began as something really cool. They retconned the Flash. The original Flash is on your right. It's Jay Garrick with that helmet from Greek mythology from Hermes. On the left, you'll see the second Flash, Barry Allen. And the Crisis, as I said, is a full reboot in action. It eliminated superfluous Earths. The cover of this issue that you're seeing here created Earth 1, where Barry Allen lives, and Earth 2, where Jay Garrick lives. And there were all sorts of ways where once a year or there was some vibration in space that allowed heroes from Earth 1 and Earth 2 to mix and match and meet each other. And it was a way for DC to use the old characters, Jay Garrick Flash, the Alan Scott Green Lantern, meeting the Hal Jordan Green Lantern. All of the old characters could meet their newer counterparts. But there was Earth 1 and Earth 2, and eventually some writer said, hey, let's have Earth 3, let's have Earth 7, let's have Earth 894. And so the Crisis on Infinite Earths eliminated a whole bunch of those and brought us down to 1. It also killed off prominent characters like the Barry Allen Flash, the Silver Age Flash you see here, Supergirl. And I remember reading this in 1985. The Barry Allen death I thought was pretty good. And the Supergirl death made me really sad. And I think it's important here to take a look at this cover because in week 4, we're going to come back and talk about this cover a little bit more. That's going to wrap it up here. For your comments, remember to make any comment you wish about the books for this week or about the pulp characters. On this video in particular, I think the pulp characters would be the best way to go. So if you're stuck, which pulp heroes do you find most interesting? What do you think about continuity? How important should it be? Is Hickman correct? Is there a comic book character that you want to see in the public domain so that everybody can deal with it? Is there a fictional character or a movie character you want to see in the public domain so everybody can deal with it? I'm betting some of you would love to see Jonathan Wick in the public domain so that a lot more people could deal with that sort of character. And don't forget, please respond to other students' comments. Just one response, one comment. Hope everybody has a good week. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know.